You're listening to the Speaking Tongues podcast. I'm your host, El Charisse. Each week, I sit down to a conversation with multilinguals where we discuss and celebrate language, life, and culture through our own perspectives. Episode 82, Speaking Italian American Italian. Hello, language lovers. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Speaking Tongues, the podcast and conversation with multilinguals. This week's episode is the last new episode of 2021, and I'm so excited to share this conversation with Luna from Collina Italiana, where we talk about the language, history, and culture of Italian Americans. This conversation is an important one because we've had the opportunity to talk about a culture and a language here in the US that is often, at best, misunderstood and at worst, stereotyped. Luna talks to us about the history of Italian immigration to the US and which regions of Italy came to influence the development of Italian spoken here. We talk about how the language is evolving over generations in the US and some common factors between recent immigrant families and those families whose ancestors immigrated generations ago. We talk about harmful stereotypes that have perpetuated about the Italian American community, so stay tuned for that segment. And because we love words around here, Luna talks to us about some words that she's researched for her series Cosa Dici, where she finds the origins of some commonly used Italian American phrases. Big thank you to Luna for having this conversation with us and giving us the history lesson we need to understand the Italian American community a lot better. This episode is just the latest in a handful of episodes where we discuss languages spoken in the US. So if you're interested in learning more about indigenous, colonial, or immigrant languages spoken here in the US, make sure you listen to episode 70, Speaking CosAdichie with San Michaud, episode 58, Speaking US Spanish with Tertulia Podcast, episode 55, Speaking Hawaiian with Halo Alelo, and episode 49, Speaking North American French and Spanish with multilingual Marissa. If you enjoyed this episode of Speaking Tongues, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Speaking Tongues podcast on Apple Podcasts, and like and subscribe on YouTube so that other language lovers like ourselves can find the show. And if you've been a long-time listener of the show, or even a recent listener, or you are feeling the holiday giving spirit, you can now support the show on buymeacoffee.com. Oh, and Patreon extras are coming soon too, so look out for those in 2022. Links to all platforms are in the show notes. Okay, let's chat. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Tongues. I'm here today with Luna. How are you today, Luna?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so happy that we're able to have this conversation. And I like to start each episode with the same question, and that is, what is your first language and which languages have you learned to speak?
So I think really my first language when I was really little was actually Italian. And that's because my dad is from Rome and my mother is from Argentina, but her father, so my maternal grandfather, was also Italian. So I have a little bit of Italian on both sides. And growing up in my house, we spoke Italian and Spanish and English. But I think I've been told that I spoke Italian first and I added in the Spanish, and then the English came along with school, and I had a little bit of an Italian accent when I was little, which obviously that went away. But so at home, Italian and Spanish and English is what we speak. And then I was lucky enough to go to a Waldorf school, which is a private school with a specific philosophy, and they like to offer multiple foreign languages. So I was lucky enough to add in French and German along the way, and then finally a little bit of Mandarin. But over the course of, college and everything, a couple of those have fallen away, and I only remember little tiny tidbits. But I would say that essentially my repertoire of languages is Italian, Spanish, French, and English.
Oh, that's really cool. So we're talking about Italian American Italian. So I just want to
Yeah.
situate the listeners. And when we say Italian American Italian, just briefly, what are we talking about?
Essentially, to kind of understand what that means, it takes a little bit of a mini kind of history lesson on the language in Italy, the linguistic history of Italy, which is more complicated than the, let's say, the linguistic history of other countries. It's a bit unique in that sense. And essentially, the Italian that we know of today is what we call standard Italian, or that's what I like to call it. That's because that's the standard that's taught in schools, and it's a grammar system with specific structure that's taught, across the country. And that's the Italian that we know and love, of course. But a long time ago, before the unification of Italy as a country, it was very split up into different kingdoms. And, over the course of time, the country that we know of now as Italy was occupied by different populations. And so obviously there was a lot of change in culture and language over time. And the different areas of the country, which we can look at now as the different regions of Italy, they were influenced by different populations. And so the language that came to be not the official, but the vernacular of each region, the common language that was spoke by the majority of the people, was very influenced by these populations. And so in the different regions, they spoke very different languages. And those are the languages that most people call dialects today. Even though when we think of a dialect, you're thinking of a language that derived from a different language. But in this case, these languages in the different regions didn't actually derive from Italian, because that standard Italian that I mentioned didn't exist yet.
Right.
And so you had all these different languages, and with the unification of the country, basically the government was like, how can we rule over a country that's so divided in this way, where the people don't speak the same language? And so they decided to basically choose one of these languages and deem it to be, the best language that would turn into the standard. And the way that they chose this language was by popularity, or let's say the power that this language had, because there were very famous authors who were from this region and therefore used this specific language. And so you have very famous authors, which in Italy they call the three crowns, le tre corone, which is Dante, of course, that we know, Boccaccio, and Petrarca. And they were from Tuscany, the region of Tuscany. And so they spoke a specific vernacular, and they wrote in that same vernacular, which is something at that time, it was pretty crazy to write in your vernacular instead of Latin. And so the government basically decided, because we love these authors so much and they're so popular and they're so intelligent and, everyone knows them, we're going to use their language and teach that across the country. And so the Tuscan dialect became the standard, essentially.
Okay.
And so that was kind of disseminated in different forms. On TV, you would only hear people speaking that specific standard Italian. And in the armies and in schools, they taught that. And so over time, that became the standard. And slowly, those smaller regional languages started to disappear. And essentially what happened is that it became like almost like the societal idea was that if you didn't speak the standard, it meant that you were uneducated. And so these regional languages started to be seen in a very negative light. And over time, then they started to get called dialects, even though they never, they existed beforehand and don't derive from that standard. So essentially, there's the long story, the short version of the long story. But what happened is that during this whole period of unification and standardization, you have Southern Italians, more so than any other Italians, immigrating to the US. And at that point, a lot of those people who immigrated didn't have a chance to learn the standard. And so they brought with them their regional languages. And for the most part, it was Sicilians and a lot of people from Naples as well, and Calabria, Campania is the region. So a lot of different southern regions came over and brought over their regional languages. And over time, that kind of meshed, with the English that was spoken here in the US at that period. And, you just have the changes that occur over time in a language, and you have a little bit of a loss of the sounds that are more typical in those Italian regional languages, and those sounds kind of evolve into sounds that are more comfortable in the English language. And essentially, over time, you have this new sort of language, because I consider it a language that emerges, and that is Italian American.
Okay.
So you'll notice that a lot of the words that are in this Italian American language come from these regional Italian languages. And so they won't really be recognized by someone who only speaks the standard, because maybe they weren't exposed to these specific regional languages. And so they really wouldn't know those words that are in Italian American. So it's a very specific kind of, marriage between the old Italian languages, these regional languages, and English, essentially. And over time, generations after generation, you have, children and grandchildren and everyone who maybe speaks less and less of that regional language, but they're keeping certain words, and the pronunciation over time changes. And that's a lot of what we hear today with those words like agita or capiche or things like that.
Where did a lot of these Southern Italians, where did they settle in the US? I mean, obviously New York, but other other parts of the country as well, right?
New York was considered the gateway to the United States. And there were basically the majority of Italian immigrants would make their first stop at New York. And then if they decided to move to different areas, we have more, I believe, more on the eastern coast, on the East Coast, than the West Coast. But there was, the majority made their first stop in New York, and a lot of those people remained in New York or on the East Coast. And you do see like big populations of Italians in like Massachusetts and Connecticut and places like that, even Chicago. So there are like these little communities that were built in other places across the country. But I would say, like, if you're really, when I was doing research on the immigration that happened, New York was nominated so many times as this gateway, the door to the US, the place that you want to be. There was a lot of potential. And so there was a lot of work and a lot of labor that was there, and the opportunities were kind of endless. And so there were a lot of hands that were needed. And so with immigrants, the first thing you need is work. And so there were a lot of opportunities there for them. And so I think that that's kind of the reason why New York was so appealing.
About the language itself, and you mentioned this, there are words that Italian Americans use that have become old-fashioned, maybe in the let's say dialect for the sake of clarity, maybe back in Italy. Do you have any examples of words that have shifted over time?
The interesting thing is a lot of the immigrants that came, like I said, came from the South. And the dialects in the South, or I like to call them the vernaculars in the South, they are basically the strongest today.
Mhm.
They're the ones that have really kind of survived over time. The rest of the country, those vernaculars, those regional languages have almost completely disappeared. And it's really sad actually to kind of see that over time they've kind of gotten lost in history. But if you go to Naples, you go to Sicily, they're still really speaking that regional language.
Mhm.
It's a very important part of the identity of those regions. And so a lot of those words still exist in their original form.
Okay.
But what's really interesting, and to me what's really cool, is that they've evolved so much that they might not be recognizable even by a speaker of that regional language. So you have like a word that I did recently was chooch. I don't know if you
Mhm.
know this one, but really chooch, if I'm calling you a chooch, it's like you're an idiot, or you're stupid, or it's more of an insult than anything else. But it comes from the word chucho in the Neapolitan regional vernacular, and essentially the word chucho means donkey.
Oh.
It can also mean idiot in that vernacular, but as you can hear from the differences, it might not be super evident that those words are the same, even though
Mhm.
they're similar. So you have chucho and chooch, but two speakers from two different areas, the U.S. and Southern Italy, it might not be so obvious that those are the same.
Right.
And so that's an example of the change that happens over time. I like to say that it becomes almost Americanized because
Mhm.
you have that regional language Neapolitan where those vowels at the end tend to be kind of reduced. So it's not as obvious that there's a vowel at the end. But then
Mm.
once those words come over to the US, we see a lot of times that vowel at the end completely disappears. And so
Mhm.
they might be recognizable by a speaker of that specific vernacular, but they also at the same time aren't as obvious. And to someone who doesn't speak that vernacular, to someone who speaks standard Italian, that word chooch is completely foreign to them. It means
Right.
it's so beyond any kind of standard Italian word that you're just kind of lost. You're
Mhm.
like, this isn't Italian. This is not. That's where the kind of negative light comes in, where people are like, this isn't Italian. This is some sort of fake Italian, or you're not a real Italian because you don't speak standard Italian. But really, you have to know the history and the kind of journey that the languages take to understand just how connected these words are to Italy as a country and its language and all of that, its
Mhm.
history, to kind of understand the relationship there. once you really dig deep, you see the journey that they've taken, and that relationship really becomes clear.
Mm. If you're listening to maybe someone in, here, an Italian American here speaking Italian, are there words that someone could use that would indicate maybe what language that their Italian American is derived from?
I would say definitely that hear you can hear in the way that someone is speaking where their family is from or where they grew up. And that's really to me, it's amazing. And you can even hear it even in Italy. My dad, who is from Rome, and so he speaks with an accent that's like a Roman accent, and that's the kind of Italian that I learned from him. So when I speak, someone from Italy, or an Italian here, or even an Italian in Italy, can recognize that I'm from Rome, or my Italian is from Rome. And now the same thing happens with immigrants who came over. Let's say, a couple comes from Sicily, they came over to New York, and now their children or their grandchildren are speaking Sicilian, or they have remnants of that Sicilian vernacular in their language now. And it's very recognizable because essentially it is the dialect hidden under kind of the Americanized pronunciation.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's still recognizable there. You have like those endings, those vowels. There are still these little hints as to, where the language is coming from in terms of location, let's say. And that's what's really cool about these regional languages, because they all have their little characteristics that become obvious through pronunciation, and in some cases even in writing. In Sicily, a lot of the time you have people writing in Sicilian, and it really looks like a completely different language if you're only familiar with the standard. And that's what's really fascinating about the languages there, is because they have these characteristics that kind of scream out, oh, I'm not standard Italian, I am Sicilian, or I'm Neapolitan, and that's what's really cool about it.
Okay. I was wondering because I feel like maybe generations ago when people were coming over from southern Italy, and there may have been more of a distinction between who was, and I'm saying this completely as a non-Italian American, just as an outsider, an outside observation. It seems like to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there may have been more of a division between who was from Naples, who was from Campania, who was from Sicily, et cetera, et cetera. And that over time, as the Italian American culture has developed, that those delineations have diminished. And maybe as people are developing in this new culture here in the States, that some of those regional words may have crossed over into like common usage, regardless of what your family's heritage is. So that's what I was really wondering about. And I guess that's a different question, just like how have you noticed if that has happened? Maybe like the example you gave of chooch. Is that something that is broad, or something that maybe you'd only hear from someone whose family came from Naples?
I think that you're completely correct. That is a great assumption that you've made there, and that's what's, to me, so interesting about the Italian American culture, because of the journey that it's taken, and it's unified these people so well, that that's why it's so strong, but at the same time, it's so misunderstood. But basically, to give you an idea, it's like you said. So at the time, because the country was in the middle of unification, Italy, of course, was in the middle of unification, you had a lot of these lines separating people, and their identity was very tied to their region, not to the country. So it was very important to say, oh, I'm from Sicily. That's the first thing that they would say, not I'm from Italy, I'm from Sicily. And so coming over into the US, you had these little communities of very specific Italians. So you had, oh, this block in Brooklyn, I know this block, it's all Sicilian. This other block over here is all Neapolitan. So it was very separate at first because of those regional ties that were so important. And it's it makes sense because you're thinking about, well, I'm coming from a country that's just now being unified. So my ties are stronger to my specific local community rather than the country, because the country is so new to me, And so that's why the people who came over had these really strong regional identities. And at first, they very much were separate. These communities of people were very separate. And in fact, they had even regional rivalries. You had Sicilians against those from Campania, which is where Naples is located. And you had these little, there was a little bit of hatred going on between the different regions. And so they had these very separate communities. And the immigration, the way that it happened, was very, very much like if my family came over and they were basically successful in their transfer over to the US and their change in environment, and they saw that they were able to kind of survive here, then they would go and tell their family back in Italy and tell them to come over as well. So that's why you had so many from these, this small area of Italy, because it was all based on, who you're telling your other family members to come over. So obviously you're going to create your own little community here with the people that you know from back home. So that's how these communities were built. But then over time, the Italians really had a tough time here in the US. And they were very hated by basically everyone. And they were seen as this, for lack of a better word, dirty. That's what they were seen as. They were seen as this dirty kind of European that's somehow like just kind of an animal. They were described as animals, essentially. And so they had a really tough time here. And what they noticed was that the discrimination that they experienced had nothing to do with their region. It had to do with the fact that they were Italian.
Right.
And so over time, you realize that these communities that felt so far from each other because they came from different regions, they got closer because of the shared discrimination that they experienced, which is it's just crazy to even say that, but it makes a lot of sense that, these populations that were being treated badly eventually came together and realized, we have to kind of join forces here, because if not, we're not really going to do well here in this country. And so then over time, like you said in your question, these people kind of came together and not necessarily forgot their regional ties, but kind of came together and realized that they had this other connection as well. And that's on the countrywide level, that kind of identity of Italian.
Right.
And so you have you have a lot of these Italian Americans who will tell you, I'm Sicilian, or my family is from Naples, or, I'm Calabrese, my family's from Calabria. But
Mm-hmm.
there isn't really that hatred anymore that
Right.
existed. And
Right.
so there's kind of more of a bigger community now that's just Italian. And I think, like you said, a lot of those words are kind of just crossing those regional lines and being used by everyone.
I'm going to ask you, do you know if the language spoken by Italian Americans is continuing to evolve? Like, have there been new words that have come out of these new words? Have there been newer words that, that are evolving?
I would say that, well, first of all, I would say yes. Coming from a linguistic perspective, language is constantly, evolving, constantly changing. We have new words popping up all the time. Like, how long ago was it that selfie came up
True.
into the world, and now it's just a regular word. So I think that all the time we have these new words coming in. But I think what's interesting and what's unique about the Italian American language is that, like I said, there was such a drastic change in the experience of the Italian immigrant in the US, right? And so the way that language was viewed completely changed. It did a complete 180. And so instead of just specific words being carried over, you have the whole language being taught to next generations. And so then I think it's almost more difficult for these specific words to kind of pop out because we have people learning the entire language. But I think that there's always specific words if you speak, if you're in a multicultural household or a bilingual household, let's say, there are always specific words in one language that you just can't find an equivalent for in that other
Right.
language, right?
Yeah.
And so, even growing up, for some reason, I never said the word remote control. I always said telecomando in Italian. Even when I went over to my friend's house, I would say, "Can you pass me the telecomando?" And they would say, "What are you talking about?" And so I think that definitely, in different families coming from different parts of Italy, they have, these little specific words that they find work better for them than an English, translation, let's say. And so I think definitely we'll see these new words coming to light, that maybe in a few years there's another word that joins the mainstream English vocabulary that comes from, an Italian American origin, let's say.
Okay.
I think also what's interesting is that, like I said, the words that I've really studied and the ones that I've talked about in my series, those are kind of the most popular ones. But I've been given lots of suggestions from different people, and it's so amazing to see just how specific and different and niche each family is based on their history. And so I'm getting a lot of these words that's like, oh, my grandmother always used to say, X, Y, and Z, and I would love to hear where that word comes from. And then you see that word really isn't used by so many people. And so there really isn't much, like, for me to read up on it. I have to do the research to kind of make the connection between that word that's being used here and its origin in a regional language, which to me is it's very exciting to kind of look up these words, and I've saved up like these specific vocabulary these sheets online and these documents and these dictionaries of regional languages to kind of see if I can find an equivalent. And in some cases, what to me is really funny is that over time, a lot of those Italian immigrants, just like they kept, some of those words in their regional languages, and those words have been Americanized over time, the opposite also occurred when they came to the US. And so there are also a lot of, and this is something that I don't touch upon in my series, but to me is just fantastic just the same. There are a lot of English words that were Italianized over time by Italian immigrants when they first came over into the US. And so there are a lot of Italian immigrants, and growing up, I experienced this a lot because my family business is in Brooklyn. So there are a lot of Italian immigrants who have kind of just taken in certain English words into their Italian vocabulary, and they almost forget that these are English words. And so, funny story is that my father, when he first came over, he spoke standard Italian, and he had, customers who would come in, this woman who, immigrated from Italy decades ago, let's say, and she's asking if she can pay with a checca. So that sounds like, can I pay with a check, right?
Yeah.
But in Italian, the word for check is assegno. So it has nothing to do with a checca. So she pulled in the word check into her Italian vocabulary and just kind of Italianized it, tacked on a vowel over there at the end, and it just became a piece of her vocabulary.
Right.
And because there are so many Italian immigrants from that period, the probability is that some of them did the same thing. And so now they have these words that were English words that have been Italianized, and a lot of people understand them. And so you have this pile of words that is crazy because it's only understood by one specific demographic,
How interesting.
And so it's crazy to me.
Yeah. That is so interesting. I've heard little stories here and there of people who kind of tease their great aunt or their grandfather who would say things, but I always, and let me just be clear, the people who would do the teasing were Italian American. It wasn't me. But I always thought that it was due to speaking English with speaking English accent and speaking with an accent. So that's really interesting. I never even considered that there would be piles and piles of words like this. So you wrote your thesis and you've done a lot of research on Italian American culture, and we know that unfortunately Italian Americans have been subject to some harsh stereotypes over time. Can we talk about some of these harmful stereotypes and maybe where they came from?
Sure. So basically, the treatment of Italians when they first immigrated was essentially just terrible, and there was a lot of violence against them. Just like, there are so many groups in the US, unfortunately, that have been, treated badly. And so Italians were one of these groups. And interestingly, when they first came over, Italians weren't even considered white, which is a crazy thing to think about, because today, obviously Italians are white, they're from Europe, but they were considered a different race entirely.
Right.
So they were treated very badly, and they were, they experienced a lot of violence. They experienced just discrimination in general. Like there were certain, a restaurant here or a store over here wouldn't want to serve them. It's the story that we're sadly all too familiar with Black people over the course of history.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that is tenfold, the story of Italian Americans.
Right.
But to me, this example of Italians and their experience in the U.S. kind of just showcases the way that these like distinctions that we make between us and the hierarchies that are somehow socially constructed, just how arbitrary they are. Because if you have Italians who at one point weren't considered white and now today they are, what does that tell you? It tells you that it's completely arbitrary.
Right.
And there's really no basis on which to compare populations of people. Right? And it all kind of stemmed from this idea of like, oh, this group of immigrants is coming over and they're taking the work that this other group of immigrants was going to have, let's say. So you had like rivalries between immigrant groups, like the Irish and the Italians and things like that. And so these big groups, these different groups kind of hating on each other. And the Italians somehow got, they got a big hit, in general. And they were just treated really badly. And what is interesting is that a lot of that kind of discrimination that was experienced back then, which was physical and violent and just terrible, today what remains is just these stereotypes, right? So we have like the idea that all Italians somehow are connected to organized crime. That's one stereotype. The other is just the idea that Italian Americans are somehow fake Italians or somehow inferior to an Italian who comes straight from Europe, right?
Right.
And those are kind of just misconceptions. And they stem from misunderstanding. Obviously, there is organized crime that exists, but not every Italian is connected to it.
Yeah.
Like I can tell you, I'm not connected to organized crime. But, so it stems from something. So it exists. Organized crime exists, obviously. And there in southern Italy, the mafia is a huge problem. And especially back then, it was a terrible problem. And even up until the 80s, it was horrible. So there exists the issue, right? Organized crime, I would say, is one of these big stereotypes. And the issue actually exists for Italians, and more so, I think, in Italy right now than in the US, right? You have the mob stories, the famous mob bosses in the US.
Right.
But in Italy, it's very different, the experience with the mafia. And I think that it's very interesting the way that the stereotype has evolved in the US, because we have these mafia movies which somehow glorify the violence,
right,
and romanticize the idea of organized crime. Whereas in Italy, you have, if you were to watch an Italian film about the mafia, it's very realistic. It tells you exactly what happened. It shows you the mistreatment of women within mafia families. It shows you the communities of people devastated by violence. It tells you, how the judicial system really can't get a grip on the mafia, the corruption in the police and in the government. So that's an example of cinema, the differences between the two countries and the way that we make films shows you, I guess the stereotype on one hand, and the reality on the other.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, one example. And the truth of the matter is, with immigration, you did have organized crime that was brought over from Italy to the U.S., but I think that that just became a stereotype, which was kind of exacerbated in the 80s and the 90s by those famous films and TV shows that just kind of glorified that whole idea. And I think that, that was a piece of things. Like, back in the day, Italians a lot of them were kind of blamed for things. They were, there was, I forgot, now I'm not remembering where, but there was, in a town, there was, I believe, 11 or 12 Italians were lynched. Like, that was something that
was in New Orleans.
Yeah. Yes, you remember. And it was because they were completely innocent, and it was because they were blamed for the murder of a police chief, and there was just this whole mess of things. And it was like, just this, I don't know, like, I don't even understand. Like, when I was doing the research, I was just like having such a tough time trying to understand where the hatred comes from. And to me, this kind of idea, this story of Italian Americans is a small example of like what we're dealing with today. And obviously last year, to me, it's like this tiny sliver that can act as an example of just how arbitrary these categorizations of people are, or like these hierarchies, like I said. It's very interesting that, a lot of these Italians were very mistreated, and nowadays, they face this kind of stereotype. I wouldn't say, obviously, we have to say that Italian Americans don't struggle. Like, they're no longer struggling today, let's say. They're not a minority facing some sort of oppression, right? But these stereotypes do exist, that kind of the idea that Italian Americans are inferior to Italians, right? But if we go and we take a look back in history, the Italians that immigrated and that worked, especially in New York, were a very important piece of Manhattan's history. To give an example, they were big, kind of a huge component of Manhattan's kind of rise to fame with the construction of the subway system and all of that. And so they were a big labor force in New York, especially.
Right.
And so they kind of just faced this discrimination, which has over time evolved. And interestingly, a piece of that change, like a factor that kind of led to that change, was the idea of Christopher Columbus, which is a very interesting story to me, because at that point, back 50, 100 years ago, let's say, Christopher Columbus was always seen as like this, the hero, the discoverer of America, right? And everyone knew that he was Italian. And so Italians at that point, and Italian Americans, right, second generations and all that, they were like, oh, so Christopher Columbus is an Italian and he's loved by Americans. So let us remind them that we are Italian, just like Christopher Columbus. And so kind of this idea came out of that. And from that was born the love of Christopher Columbus from Italian Americans, right? And now you have like the Columbus Foundation. You have all these little organizations that represent, the Italian American heritage and culture. And the face of it, they decided, to make Christopher Columbus. And obviously nowadays
Right.
we've, going, to me, this is kind of funny because in the end, it's not like Christopher Columbus was a huge savior to the Italians. They just kind of taxed themselves on because they were being treated badly and they didn't want to have that anymore, right?
Yeah.
So nowadays, you have these Italians or Italian Americans as well who are so proud of Christopher Columbus because over time, this idea has evolved so much, right? And so they're really defensive when it comes to the issues, today that we have now that we've kind of taken a good look at history and have realized what Christopher Columbus did, right?
Right.
And so you have these people, like I've actually debated with people about Indigenous Peoples Day and like why Christopher Columbus did, hurt a lot of people, to say the least, right? And so it's funny to see kind of how the idea of him has changed over time for these people because it was this kind of a key component for changing their image in society, right? So that's kind of like a little story that factored into the change of Italians and their kind of treatment. But you can see that it was even recently in history that Italians were kind of hated. Like even JFK, he was friends with Frank Sinatra, and a lot of his advisors actually told him not to be photographed with Sinatra because it would bring down his approval rating. Right. Because Frank Sinatra is Italian American. And so it's crazy to think about that because that wasn't really that long ago. And so you can see just how much has changed since then, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's really crazy because I think that we look at like you mentioned like films and shows of the 80s and 90s, Goodfellas, Sopranos, and etc., and things that have glorified this kind of um organized crime and glorified it for the masses. And what I think it's important, and I'm glad that you brought these things up. I think it's important for people to realize that it may look glamorous on TV, but it's still discrimination, and it may be like cool, um, to do your Joe Pesci imitation and to to be like, because I'm not gonna lie, I love
Yeah.
Goodfellas. I think Goodfellas is a phenomenal movie. But when you really sit and think about it, it's like, it's not fair. I mean, it's cool for, the actors and the director and everything, but it's not cool for like your friend who has like a really long 6-syllable Italian last name to be conflated with organized crime. And, this person is maybe just trying to get a job or just trying to apply for a loan or something like that. Like those are the things that people need to realize. Entertainment is entertainment, but it's harmful even if it's making light or even if it's glorifying and making it look cool, that it has harmful repercussions on just ordinary people who are just trying to make a living and feed their families just like everyone else in this world is trying to do. So I'm really glad that you talked about that and you touched on that. So I want to talk about your series. You mentioned it a few times, your Cosa Dici series that you do with Collina Italiana. Um, Tell me, when did you decide to start a series like this? And for for people who are listening who maybe haven't heard the series, just briefly let us know what it's about, and most importantly, um, maybe I said this. What are some of the favorite words that you've analyzed for the series? And tell us where we can find it.
Sure. So basically, I work for Collina Italiana, which is an Italian school and cultural center on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. And we teach everyone from young kids to adults And essentially, we were looking for some sort of tidbit of information that we could kind of create into a series and offer people these mini lessons on information that is both enjoyable, but also, important, educational, informative, and all that jazz.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were thinking about this idea of incorporating the Italian American population in the US, because obviously, as an Italian school in the US, we're teaching standard Italian, right?
Right.
But we also don't want to ignore this entire population and the language that comes along with it, right? And as a linguist, I really enjoy, the history of languages and the changes that occur within them. And so I had always been fascinated with these little words that we hear, and I always kind of wanted to discover their origins and kind of just learn about them more than just hearing them, on the streets of Brooklyn, let's say.
Right.
And so we came up with this idea of Cosa Dici, starting from this first subject of Italian American words. And essentially, Cosa Dici, the phrase, means, what are you saying? And so the idea is that the series can kind of cover a multitude of subjects, and we started with the Italian American words that we all know and love. And so we started covering these words, and it's been really fun to see the reactions. And I get these emails from a lot of our students who have, who are third generation Italian Americans, who remember their grandmother or their mother using these words, and it just kind of is a great nostalgic moment for them. And I love getting those reactions. And I would say that probably the most recognized word, I would say, is gabagool, because it's just so popular. And I think that learning where it comes from and seeing the change over time, you can really understand how it became gabagool. And so it adds so much more meaning to the word. But I'm very excited because we've just announced that there's a new segment on the series where I'm going to be shifting to cuisine, and I'm going to be looking at the history of different Italian American dishes. And so it's going to be really fun. Yes, it's going to be really fun. And I'm going to really enjoy talking about all these dishes that we know and we have in the US. And I'm really going to emphasize these distinctions, that we talked about today, and talk about, equivalents in Italy, or maybe the fact that these things don't exist in Italy, and just the stories behind them, basically. And it's really exciting to have this series because it's so flexible and it's so open-ended, because essentially you can, what are you saying? I can tell you about anything, really, and I can explain and kind of get you to understand what I'm saying. And so it's going to be really fun to take a little bit of a break from the language aspect of things and turn to another great part of the culture, the cuisine, of course. So it's going to be really exciting, and you can find everything on the website, collinaitaliana.com. And if you go to our About tab, there's our series there, Cosa Dici, and you can watch all the episodes. They're all there. And hopefully we'll have some other fun segments in the future.
I want to ask you, just, have you done, okay, this is really random, but did you watch Golden Girls?
I did not, actually.
Oh man. Okay, so this is going to sound dumb, but Sophia, the the oldest one, Dorothy's
Mm-hmm.
mother, she was a Sicilian immigrant. And it was kind of a running joke in the series that, she would talk about things that she did and, picture it, Sicily, 1910. And, she would tell all these stories. Dorothy's husband, her ex-husband was this like total loser, Stan.
Mm-hmm.
And Sophia used to always call him a Bajikaloop. And I've
Oh.
I've never heard that word outside of Golden Girls before, and I don't even know how to spell it to, like, understand, like, what it came from or what it means,
Mm-hmm.
and, obviously, this show was in the '80s, and they were talking about a woman who was living during, like, World War II. So,
Mm-hmm.
if no one's requested that and you do get back to the language thing, um, I'm putting in my official request.
Yeah, I will definitely have to look into that one. I don't recognize it off the bat, but I will definitely look this up. And I'm sure that people have asked the same question. So we'll have to see where it comes from. I think this is a really good one.
Luna, this conversation has been so much fun to have, and I learned so much from you in this time that we've been talking. And I really have so many more things I could talk to you about and ask you. And I feel like we could talk for a really long time, but I just wanted to say, you're always welcome to come back and, talk more about Italian American culture and language. And I've really had a blast talking with you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate having the time to kind of just ramble on about my favorite subjects. Hopefully this is kind of a new subject for people, and hopefully they get interested and to learn a little bit more. And I really had a great time. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I like to end each episode with the same question, and that is, it's my last question. That is, do you have any jokes, tongue twisters, cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in Italian or in Italian American to share?
Oh man. Well, I think my favorite word to use in I got this from my maternal grandfather, who's
Hmm.
Calabrese, but I'm not sure if this word is used in other kind of regions, but it is capatosta. So it essentially means that you're hard headed and
Mm,
you're basically like you're persistent and you don't change your mind.
mm.
And I've been called it many times by my mother and my grandfather, and it's always stuck with me. And I think it's a great one. I think also to add on to that,
Is that
in
capatosta?
yeah, capatosta.
Capatosta. Okay.
Yeah, so it just means like capa would mean like your head, and
Mm,
tosta. I don't have a specific translation for that, but essentially the word means hard headed.
okay.
Um, and another fun one would be this is more something that you would hear more in Rome, I believe, but I got it from my dad that when you something's like something surprised you or you're kind of perplexed and you don't know what to do, what to say, you're kind of surprised, you would say ammazza, which
Amatsa.
yeah, which is really interesting because the verb ammazzare
Hmm.
means to kill.
Oh my
And
God.
so you're literally just saying kill. And I don't understand it, but it's something that comes to me so naturally when I'm like perplexed or like somebody does something and I'm like, wow, I'm matza. So
Mm,
I guess that's a fun one. It's very recognizable. Like a lot of the teachers at Collina Italiana are from the north
mm.
of Italy, and because I kind of speak with that Roman accent, like I said, the first time I said ammazza, they immediately were like, wow, ammazza, a classic. so, so it's very, it's just very recognizable. I couldn't tell you if they're kind of old fashioned because now it's been like 30 years since my dad has
Mm.
lived in Italy. So who knows if it's still even used.
Thank you so much again. And before I let you go, just really quickly, don't think about this too hard, but in this situation, when we've been talking for quite some time, in Italian, what would be the best way to say goodbye?
I would say that typically, kind of daily, I tend to use ciao,
Mm.
but when it's someone that you don't see that often and you hope to see them again, you would just say arrivederci.
Arrivederci, Luna, e grazie mille ancora. And I'll be talking to you soon.
Grazie mille e ci vediamo. Spero che ci vediamo presto.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye bye.